What is up, everybody? This is your guy Kalai, and welcome back to Budget Buys. And today, I'm going to be talking about something that I've been wanting to get into for a while now. And that is switches. Specifically, premium switches, because while I have talked about Altimu clones for a little while, those aren't really what people are going to be focusing on when getting into the mechanical keyboard hobby. And as luck would have it, Mozano reached out to me asking if I wanted to try out their new switch right as I was putting together a list of switches that I'd love to make videos about. And now is where I should go ahead and say that these switches were provided free of charge by Mozano, but no money changed hands, and as such, I don't really consider this a sponsored video. However, it might be considered payment in kind, so I'm going to flag it as such. With that little caveat out of the way, let's take a closer look at these switches and do so in such a way where my ring lights aren't constantly reflecting off of the jar, because these are actually pretty unique. So what we have here is a 5-pin linear switch with a nylon housing and a color scheme inspired by the show Killing Eve, which, if I'm being perfectly honest, I had never heard of prior to being approached about this video. And for those of you watching who are in the same boat, Killing Eve is a British spy thriller made for BBC America and BBC Three, based on the Villainelle novel series by Luke Jennings. And the show is in the 4th series right now, so there's a whole lot of stuff to unpack. I'm not going to do that in this video. However, I will take a moment and say that I really like the color scheme. And while I don't know how much it has to do with the aesthetic of the show, because I'll admit I haven't watched any of it, I have become quite obsessed with the vaporwave aesthetic. So the light blue, purple, and pink together really gives off that kind of vibe. Now let's talk about price, because that's one of the main things people are going to be paying attention to when they start modding their keyboards. And I'm going to go ahead and say it, these are not the cheapest switches on the block. As of the recording of this video, these switches are available in 3 different quantities. If you buy the 70 pack, that's going to cost you $52. The 90 pack, which is what I have here, is going to set you back $65, and the 110 pack is going to set you back $80. And I know that sounds a little steep, especially if you've been looking at switches from brands like Altimu, but switches get pricey. These come out to a little under 75 cents per switch, no matter the quantity. Though, of course, the 110 pack is a little bit cheaper per switch than the 70 pack. But keep in mind, brands like Kale are going to cost a little bit more per switch, Cherry is going to cost significantly more per switch, and then there are even more boutique level switches that can go well over $2 per switch. And if you start looking at some of the discontinued switches with a cult following, some of those can get to like the double digits per switch. In fact, there's a Cherry locking switch that I've been trying to hunt down that regularly sells for like 12 bucks or more per switch, and I still really want one. So price is very much relative here. Also, something very important to keep in mind is the fact that opaque switches like these tend to be on the pricier side. So under 75 cents a switch, even at the smallest quantity, for this style of opaque switch with a nylon housing and one more feature that I'm going to demonstrate shortly, is actually kind of a steal. And of course, there's the added bonus of the color scheme, which is themed to match multiple accessories, including keycaps, and even a couple of those neat coiled aviator style USB cables. Also, as of the recording of this video, there is a slight discount on these switches. And if you'd like even more of a discount, you could always use the promo code CLYFAKER on the Mozano website to get 10% off. That is not an affiliate code. I don't get any additional money if you use it. It's just something nice that Mozano wanted to offer to my viewers. Now, let's take a closer look at this switch, because even though I did a spec rundown earlier, there's still a few things that I want to touch on. And word of warning to any keyboard enthusiasts watching this video, but some of the things I'm about to talk about are going to seem beginner level, And that's because that's who I make these videos for, especially since I'm pretty much a beginner as well. Feel free to skip ahead if that seems a bit boring. And to give you an idea of how rudimentary the things I'm about to talk about are, let's start off with pin counts. Because as I said earlier in the video, this is considered a 5-pin switch. So if I flip it over, I'm probably confusing a few of the people out there now. And until recently, I would have been confused about this as well. If you know anything about electronics, when using the word pin in that context, what you're going to be talking about are the metal contacts. And as you can see here, this only has 2 metal contacts, as does this Altimu switch, which is referred to as a 3-pin switch. So obviously the word pin must mean something completely different when used in the context of mechanical keyboard switches. And what we're talking about in this context has to do with the number of protrusions on the bottom of the switch. In the case of the Altimu switch, we have the 2 metal contacts as well as the central nub, which you can see there. And that is just the part that allows the switch shaft to move up and down. Has a little bit of room in the cavity there. It also helps center the key switch onto the PCB. And in the case of the Mozano switch, we have the 2 metal contacts, the central nub, as well as these 2 additional posts. And that is where the 5-pin count comes in. And then there are total weirdos like this no-brand switch that have no metal contacts and only the central post. And before you think I've disassembled the switch, nope, it is fully functional. This is an optical switch, which uses a little beam breaking post in the center there. It has absolutely nothing to do with this video, I just thought I'd be silly. Now, as for the 2 additional posts on the Mozano switch, these are going to limit the number of PCBs that you can reasonably plug this switch into. But at the same time, so will the metal contacts. Because this switch uses contacts that are pretty much identical to those found on cherry switches, and that means that by default, it's not going to be compatible with the sleeve style hot swap favored by Altimu due to the difference in pin thickness. You would have to trim or file those down a little bit in order to make it fit. But fortunately, most cherry switches and their clones are going to be compatible with Kale style hot swap, which uses these sockets as you can see here and on the back of the PCB. And most of these boards are going to have the additional holes for 5-pin hot swap. So you can just easily slide it in like so. Doing this through a viewfinder is a lot harder than you'd think. Now, one more pretty big difference between the Mozano switch and the Altimu switch has to do with most of the PCBs on the market today. And I'm not talking about the number of pins that it's compatible with. Instead, I'm talking about LEDs. Because while pretty much every single Altimu switch I've come across these days has absolutely no problem letting the LED built into the PCB shine through, thanks to this little window here, the same cannot be said about the Mozano switch. It's pretty much a solid piece back here. Which means that while you could probably get a little bit of ambient light from the LED through those little holes, what you're actually going to want to do is solder through an LED like this, which works perfectly fine. In fact, if you look closer, it does support 4 pins on the LED, which means that you could go with an RGB compatible variant. And before you start scoffing at the Mozano switch for doing that, keep in mind that this is also done in the vast majority of opaque cherry switches and many others. It's these clear top switches, which are coincidentally sometimes referred to as RGB switches, that changed things up. Now for the next thing I want to show you, I'm going to need to open this switch up. So let me go ahead and bring in my switch opener, which I should go ahead and say, you need to make sure you have a switch opener that is compatible with the 4 side pin design that you see on cherry switches versus the single clip design that you see on Altimu switches. And coincidentally, my switch opener actually handles both without issue. But just take the switch, place it in top, give it a press, and then realize that I need to sharpen one side of my switch opener. I only really pried one side open, so let's rotate this around. That's what I get for going with the cheapest one I could find. There we go. And now, to make sure I don't lose anything, let's just grab it with this tool. And I'll be right back with my switch tray. All right, that's better. Now, if we take a closer look at this switch stem, you might notice that it's reflecting quite a lot of light. And that's not because JWC, which, by the way, is the manufacturer of this switch, used a very shiny plastic. In fact, if you take a look at the top of the stem, you'll notice it's not really reflecting much light at all. Instead, what happened is that these switches are lubricated from the factory, and that's going to give you a much smoother actuation and a much nicer experience. On the flip side, this cherry stem was not lubricated either at the factory or after I got my hands on it, and you can definitely see the difference. Side note, the tray that I have the switches in right now is referred to as a lubrication station because that's actually something pretty popular in the mechanical keyboard hobby community. One last thing I want to talk about when it comes to the internals of these Mozano switches is the fact that they use a spring that is significantly longer than the competition. In this picture, the gold spring is from the Mozano Eve switch, and the silver spring is from the cherry green switch. And I want to say the Mozano spring is about 30% or so longer than the cherry switch. However, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to meet a lot of resistance when you're using the Eve switch. In fact, here's the infographic off of the Mozano website, and the important information for this part of the video at least is the fact that the switch itself is going to travel about 3.7 millimeters, give or take 0.3 millimeters, which I do think is impacted by that longer spring, since pretty much every cherry or Altimu switch I looked up the specs for is going to travel about 4 millimeters, and the operating force is about 48 grams with a bottom out force at 55 grams. And that puts it in between the cherry red and the Altimu red, because the operating force of the Eve switch is pretty close to the 47 grams that you're going to see in an Altimu red, though admittedly significantly more than the 37 grams you're going to see in a cherry red, but the bottom out force is closer to the cherry red's 54 grams versus the Altimu red's 61 grams. I just thought that was kind of neat. And in fact, this kind of puts it in the same ballpark as the ever popular Gateron Yellow, which has an operating force of 50 grams and a bottom out force of 60 grams. And there you have the Mozano Eve switch inspired by the show Killing Eve. A little 5-pin premium switch to keep in mind whenever you're upgrading a keyboard. And as for my opinion of these switches, I like them. I like them a lot, even though they're not compatible with surface mount LEDs. Because, to be perfectly honest, I seldom use those. I'm generally using my keyboard either with the LEDs turned off or just locked in a single color. So even just doing a straight solder through LED wouldn't be a bad deal for me. And side note, they do make little hot swap sockets for your LEDs. With that being said, having this as my first foray into the more premium colored switch market has definitely been interesting, especially since Mozano also makes matching cables and keycaps based on this color scheme. And spoiler alert for an upcoming video, they did send me a set of caps and the cable I showed you earlier that I'm going to be using in a custom keyboard build. And I'm really looking forward to it because these switches type like a dream. I've really been digging red linear switches recently, and the fact that these have the slightly stiffer actuation force of an Altimu red combined with the lighter bottom out force of a cherry red and even a slightly lighter bottom out force than the ever popular Gateron Yellow really makes these switches fun to use at least for me. Also, as I said at the start of this video, while these switches are not the cheapest option when it comes to aftermarket switches, depending on where you look, these are going to end up being significantly cheaper than a lot of the opaque and or 5-pin switches out there. I've seen people spend way more money on a custom keyboard build than the one I've got coming up, and that one is still going to end up being probably the most expensive keyboard that I'll be featuring on this channel for a while. But I've gone on way longer about these switches than I ever had any intention to, so until next time, this is your guy Cly, signing off.